You pick the things that are important to you, whether it's football or quilting or restoring an old tractor or having an immaculate lawn or a good-looking farm. Nothing wrong with those things. We put ourselves into them. We really try to do our best. We feel a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment. No qualms with that. But Jesus' teaching today is not about that. It's about who comes first. And in the gospel passage that I read, in the scripture that I had, I don't know which one it was in the missalette here today, but Jesus talks about not just turning yourself against your mother, father, brother, sisters, or your very life, but he talks about hating it. And so we have to understand really what he's talking about, huh? So he doesn't mean the kind of hate like, oh, I just hate broccoli. He talks about the fact that it's an idiom that Jesus uses to help people to understand that no matter what things we have in life, that God has to come first. And so he took the things that should be the most precious in our life, okay? Spouses, kids, brothers, sisters, even our very life, and he uses that as the example, okay? He doesn't say, unless you renounce asparagus, you can't be my disciple. He says he picks the things that he knows should be the most important thing in our lives, our relationships. And he says, I have to come first. I have to come first. It's interesting because I think that that's a struggle a lot of times for us. Last week, we talked about, are you saved? So somebody came up to Jesus and said, Lord, are there just a few in number who are going to be saved? And so we talked about that last week, about what does that mean to be saved. So I wonder how many of you even thought about that this last week. Did you think about whether or not you were saved? Of course you didn't, because you're Catholic. You say, oh no, I'm not saved, I'm Catholic, I don't have to worry. Okay? It's what place does God play in our life? That's really what the scripture readings are talking about today, is a sense of priority. And so that's why he says, unless you hate, unless you turn your back on, unless you renounce these things, you can't be my disciple. Now, it brings us to a very simple truism about faith, and that's this. If we really try to keep Jesus as number one, all the other issues that we have, all the other things that we struggle with, we'll have a different way of looking at him. However, if Jesus is not number one, if our faith is not number one, then everything connected to it, like going to church on Sunday or any of the kinds of things that we do as our devotional practices, they're all going to be a pain in the neck. And they're going to be inconveniences because God's not number one. God's number one, it's a no-brainer. If he isn't, if it's just one of a lot of other things that I kind of have to pay my dues on, then my faith will always be a chore. It will always be in the way. It will always be inconvenient. It just is the way it is. It just is the way it is for us as human beings. Now, I think that one of the most instructive things that we do to learn from Jesus is to look at his followers. And so today's gospel talks about there was a great crowd following Jesus. And we hear that a lot of times in the scriptures. Did you ever stop to think about who those people are? I mean, the disciples didn't have any choice, okay? They kind of had to go along because otherwise he would have known they were absent. But what about all these crowds? Who are they? I think you know. They're the poor, the sick, the downtrodden, the outcasts, the losers. Those are the ones who recognized Jesus first. Did you ever think about that? They recognized Jesus, not the religious right. The religious right, some of them never did get it because he didn't fit their mold. But these folks recognized Jesus right away. Why? Because he understood their woes. He understood their station in life. There was somebody who got them. And because he understood them, they saw in him a master who could give them some hope. Not somebody who was always judging them, who was always saying who's right and who's wrong, who's in or who's out. Jesus never did that with them. So those are the people who first recognized who Jesus was. Now, who are those people today? Well, it's the kids that are still in cages. You know, we don't like to think about this, but there's still under 200 kids that are still in cages separated from their parents. How long has that been? And it doesn't bother us. It's the people who society has deemed an outcast, whether it's somebody who's trying to get a job after they've been in prison, whether it's somebody whose orientation or political party we don't agree with. It's the people who work on our farms that we don't want to pay a living wage for. That's these people. That's these people. And somehow we've kind of, as mainstream Christians, kind of become admirers of Jesus. We look at Jesus from a distance and say, oh, he was really nice. Jesus doesn't want admirers, he wants disciples. And disciples are the people who act on what he did. Okay, so those are the people he hung around with. Those are the people that he tried to make changes in their lives. And that's what he asks us to do as we look at these kinds of issues in our lives. So I think when you take a look at this idea about what it means about what does it mean to pick up your cross, don't be poking the person sitting next to you about you're my cross and I'm going to bear you patiently. I really think that when we talk about picking up our cross, it's that day-to-day struggle, number one, of trying to keep God number one. It's hard to do. There's a lot of good things that get in the way. And they can become co-equal. But they can't become co-equal to the gospel. The gospel that we're just going to baptize this little girl here in just a few moments in is a gospel that doesn't compromise. It's not a buffet line like you go through at Pizza Ranch, you know, and they're all kind of all the same, okay? There's one thing that's significant. So when I think about picking up my cross, I'll tell you what mine is. I get weary sometimes. I get weary when people get crabby about the mass times or where their masses or it inconveniences them instead of being really grateful that there's a bunch of people in church. Okay? I get crabby and get weary about people who make ridiculous claims about things, never bother to check them out, or they don't want to support a parish because there's something they don't like, so they just don't go, or they don't support. None of those things have anything to do with Jesus Christ. You see, when your eyes get off Christ, all this other stuff becomes a pain in the neck. I've never once talked to somebody who had a complaint, who had Christ first, that was not legitimate. But when we don't do that, then the rest of this becomes ridiculousness. But you know what it tells me when I get weary? It's a great lesson for me, because it reminds me that all of a sudden now God's not first in my life. Because I'm letting a lot of other things, letting you, letting a schedule, letting the mileage, that's become more important than God. So it's a great slap in the face to remind me when I get overwhelmed by those things, hey, wait a minute. You're no better than anybody else. You can let things get in the way as well. Do you see what I'm saying? And so when Jesus says, you know, in the last line of the gospel today, unless you renounce your possessions, you cannot be my disciple, he doesn't mean that you have to give up everything, although most of us could clean out our garages and our closets and our sheds and probably do with a lot less. That's not the point. The point is that if our stuff is the master of us, takes more of our time, takes more of our attention than God does, then it's problematic. That's all he's saying. That's all he's saying. And so as we continue to pray in the Mass today, it's more than just a question of priority. Because I think that you wouldn't be here this morning if this wasn't a priority for you somewhere along the line, okay? But we're not looking for admirers. We're looking for disciples. And disciples who, in everything that you're dealing with in your life, are saying, how does Jesus fit into this first? So if you got problems in your marriage, Jesus has to come first. If you're trying to figure out what's going on with your finances, Jesus has to come first. If you're dealing with a personal problem with your addiction, Jesus has to come first. If he does, the rest of these things will be much more manageable and albeit very successful. So when he says, unless you pick up your cross daily and follow me, you can't be my disciple, nobody can make that decision for you. Only I can make it for me. Only you can make it for you.